Hello, and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk about what it means to be a game. But before we get into that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what this podcast is about?
Well, it's pretty simple. We like to talk about games of all shapes and varieties. Speaking of varieties, we have just added a new variety to our diverse selection of tabletop games. Yesterday was the first session of my my Hell's Rebels game, which is going to be starting up on a regular basis. I think Thursday nights is what we said, like we locked in on in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, I guess the recap there was I've tinkered pretty extensively with the opening, and I made a prison level so that everyone starts in prison, because the story of Iron Gods is the oppressive, lawful evil dictator comes to town, and so I wanted to switch that up a little bit. All of the players started as criminals who have broken one of a myriad laws in Kintargo, and they started in that prison, and then of course the story of their escape. I don't know, how did you feel? Did you enjoy that first lovely look at Hell's Rebels?
Yeah, just to note for the audience at home, it is Hell's Rebels. You called it Iron Gods again at the beginning.
That's not my fault.
Yeah,
except it is.
Yeah, but yeah, I thought it was super fun. My character got to do some stuff. It is becoming more and more painfully obvious that he will never do anything in combat.
Yeah, he was pretty useless in combat. He was also really useless when getting out of that DC 5 strength check.
Yeah, right? Yeah,
I literally
maybe in a row.
Yeah, I was literally in the shower, and I was in the shower and I was thinking about it. I was just kind of like rehearsing myself through kind of the steps. And I just thought about it because I had read your character sheet and I saw that you gave your dude a 7, and I was like, originally it was just a foregone conclusion that you could just rip out of the shackles when you enter the altered state. But I was like, nah, I want to stick it to Mango a little bit, and I made it a DC 5 strength check that he failed twice.
Yep, it was a DC 5, and I rolled ones twice. It's not even like I could. I'm thinking it's not even like I could burn inspiration to try and solve that. But yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun actually. I think that eventually we might come to a point where I might need to do a little bit of adjustment, just because I can already see kind of things start to form where it's like, well, I'm good at every skill check because I have like something like 12 skill points, I think. I just have so many skills, and like every time something comes in, well, I can do that, and it's like that might step on some other people's toes as to being able to do things, and then at the same time, let's be like, well, you get to do combat and I don't, so I get to do the skill check. So I think that might... I've kind of considered that when building the character out in the first place. I'm hoping it won't be an issue, and I think it'll be, at the very least, something interesting to explore down the line. I think at worst we can, like, the character can get retired or murdered or something, and can reroll into something a little bit less specialized.
Yeah, I wonder, I kind of wonder how that's going to play out in practice. I think it might warrant some like back end work almost to fix, so to speak, but I don't really know. It's one of those things where it kind of goes both ways, and I do think I think it's gonna be a thing to make sure that that people are relevant. The first session, or I guess the second session, will hypothetically be very super RP focused, because it's literally, sitting down and setting a roadmap of these are the goals, these are what we want, this is the structure, all of that stuff. And I think it's going to be time intensive, right? I don't think we're going to be able to just like dive into adventuring, because the rebellion mechanics for managing your organization are pretty extensive and like require that time. And it's one of those things where like I want to make sure that Enoch, who's playing a very combat-focused character, doesn't necessarily tune out. Not to pick on Enoch or anything, just to say that his character is much more focused on combat, as seen by him like one-shotting 3 of those guys, 4 of those guys, maybe like with those charge attacks.
Yeah, and I think personally, I think I've got some answers for that. I think I'm going to try and maneuver the character more into some types of battlefield control, kind of like Wooden Wanderer kind of does sometimes.
You should multi-class into Warlord, dude.
That's actually not a terrible idea, I don't think, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
but yeah, so we stormed out. We managed to take the right turn, I think, every time, just by pure chance.
Yeah, there are a couple of different... I mean, in the tradition of ridiculously over-designed buddy dungeons, there were a couple of different routes that you could have used to escape. That one was actually my favorite route because it's so flashy. Like, not only do you escape, but you also set every prisoner in the vault free with you, which is obviously going to have some implications socially in Kintargo.
That's good to know. I kind of half expected that, like, at some point it was going to be like, well, after they make 3 turns, they'll hit a staircase up type of deal, and kind of like the adjusted railroad type of.
No, I could straight up show you the entire. I could straight up show you the entire map. There was a level because you went to the room with the staircase up. You could have gone down. You could have gone to the sub level and gone and explored in there. It's another thing because I plan on reusing the vault map. Like I don't want to. I obviously don't want to like show it to you. But maybe after the campaign is over, of thing. It's huge. I went nuts with that thing.
Yeah, but I thought it was a cool experience, like a cool way to do things, like burn all the warrants in the attic. That way you can, what was it, kind of abscond with your whatever.
Yeah, that was it would have. You're basically skipping out on a later mission, because it was if you escape without doing that. So to speak, like if you don't escape using that method, if you escape by some of the other things, you would have had to go back to it in order to make sure that you weren't going to be, arrested by the Tatari kind of thing. And that would have been its own session. But, you took care of it on your own. Good job.
Yeah. No,
Proud of you.
I'm actually really excited for, just as people at home know, Buddy kind of let us just kind of build our characters, and we're mandated to have like the deeper backstory stuff for the next time. And I actually kind of like this. I don't know if you did this intentionally or not, but I kind of like being able to kind of feel out some of the details of your character. And
yeah, it's 100% intentional. I feel the exact same way.
Yeah, no, like I was like last night I was thinking as I was going to sleep, it was like, I'm gonna raise the pitch of my southern drawl a little bit. That way I seem a little bit more lighthearted and a little bit less ominous.
That's good. Yeah,
because I was thinking about what I wanted to do with the character, and I kind of wanted to be a little bit more of a like a shyster or a con artist, and a little bit less of kind of like an overlord type of like I will regain my power type of deal. And that's kind of how I played him last night, and I kind of want him to I kind of want him to be a little bit more like a oh well, come down, y'all. Like maybe not that bad, but just a little bit more lighthearted.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. That is 100% intentional. It's not a pet peeve because I think it's fine. It doesn't bug me or anything. But what always happens, like this is what happened with Kenzo. It's also happened with Kanbei. Basically, all of my like hardcore characters. I wrote out this giant backstory or whatever, and like this personality, and I had it all in my head. And then as I started getting into it, a lot of that stuff kind of warped, and like the character kind of like took on his, for instance, I've talked about this before, but like I make a special effort to like kind of stutter and be obtuse, because he's really low charisma. He's not a good talker, and so I like that Kenzo is, he's a foot in the mouth kind of guy. But I don't really, that's not stuff that I discovered in my backstory. That's not stuff I put in my backstory. That's stuff, or in my character description or whatever. That's stuff that I only kind of discovered as I was playing him. And so now, if I were to go back and reread it, it's just kind of, it's a little bit, the personality on paper is a little bit different than what actually comes out in game. So I like giving a little bit of time, having that to offset that dissonance.
I agree. But I think how to play, as is the recurring theme on this podcast, I think different ways to play characters and whatnot is probably its own podcast at some point.
Yeah, geez, tell me about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so before we get into the main topic, did you do anything neat this week in video games?
Well, I have restarted. I have this is my fourth playthrough of Mass Effect 2 that I have just started. My favorite game of all time. I just beat Mass Effect 1 on the PC, which was, ironically, it actually held up way better than I thought it did. At first, it really kind of sucked almost, and I was like, oh my god, this game is so bad compared to the other ones. But then as I got into it more, and as I like rediscovered my old kind of like mental, like the unused Mass Effect synapses started firing, I was actually totally with it. Like by the like the back half of playing that game. And now I'm kind of halfway through Mass Effect 2, and I love that game so fucking much, dude. It's so fucking good. One of the things I'm really noticing on, as a PC player compared to a console player is a huge difference in how I play the game based on mouse and keyboard, because mouse and keyboard has more like quick slots. I'm much more ability focused than I was, whereas on the console I'm a lot more kind of cover movement shooter focused, because there just aren't as many face buttons to map to my squad's powers. So I'm doing a lot more things where, like, I'm bringing on very complementary squad members so that I could use their. I do this commonly with the two squad members, Miranda and Jack. Jack has pull, which will suspend an enemy in midair, and Miranda has warp. And if you apply warp to a target that's affected by a biotic field, it will explode and do a whole bunch of damage or whatever. So I can just clear, like low-level enemies by having Jack warp, or Jack pull and Miranda warp, and it explodes and knocks everybody back. And then I'm playing a Vanguard, so I get to biotic charge into the fray, with a shotgun and just clean everybody up while they're, getting back on their feet, kind of thing. And that style of gameplay is very alien compared to what it was like playing it on the console, which is much more, it was much more personal and selfish, kind of about you about you maneuvering and shooting, because the downside to playing on the PC is that third person shooters are very clunky, and movement across the map is not good compared to the joysticks.
Interesting. No, I was thinking at some point of replaying the Mass Effect stuff, and I was going to do that with the controller. So, and I played them originally with the keypad. So maybe I'll have some thoughts to share from the opposite perspective.
Oh, really? Yeah. I would have used the controller. You just you can't. They're.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the PC port doesn't have. I think this is kind of before we got like the influx of Xbox 360. Controllers used as part of PC. I can do it with Dragon Age Inquisition, for instance, and I did it with Dragon Age Inquisition, but
all right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe then I won't have those thoughts to share, because unless I can come up with a way to force it to, which I might be able to, but that's for another time. But yeah, for my week in video games, I played through Metal Slug X, which was a half hour of. So, are you familiar with Metal Slug at all, buddy? The Metal Slug game?
Yeah, I know the Metal Slug games quite well.
And it was a fun romp, and I died a bunch, and I realized that game is very, very short. It really just meant to kind of pull quarters out of you. It was still fun.
That's how I feel about all the Metal Slug games. There used to be one at a movie theater that we would always go play when I was a kid. Like that, and Time Crisis 4 and stuff.
Yep, no, it was a good half hour. It was a good, it was like $1 on Steam. So, I also played a little bit of Mac Pixel just because it was sitting in my Steam library and I hadn't played it yet. It's okay. That's as much as I'm like. I really have nothing else to say about it other than it's okay.
Fair enough.
And the only other thing I wanted to touch on is I tried to play a little bit of Warhammer End Times Vermintide.
Oh, really? Yeah. How did you like that?
So it didn't run particularly well, so I only played like one mission. but it feels kind of like a fantasy version of Left 4 Dead or something like that. And
I'm a huge fan of those types of games. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, though I've played hours and hours and hours of the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, which is very similar.
Huh. Interesting, because I would love to play this game. Maybe we can get the other guys who play Mass Effect 3 to maybe get Vermintide.
Yeah, man, I will go deep on Vermintide.
Because I'm kind of excited to play that with other people and play it on a system that isn't a laptop that can handle it. The only other thing to mention, I think, is that in my quest to kind of sate my MMO thirst but get away from tab targeting because it's a system I really don't like, I downloaded and tried like 6 or 7 different MMOs.
Wow, jeez.
And like the first one I was going to try was Terra, and then I booted it up and I discovered that the Gunner class is only available to female avatars, which bothers me, and so I immediately uninstalled it.
That's good.
And like that game's supposed to be very good, and nothing is. I don't like playing cross-gender avatars. If you do, more power to you. It's just not my thing. And I really wanted to play a Gunner class, so I downloaded the one I ended up playing a little bit more of is C9 Continent of the Ninth Seal. And that it seems cool, but again, my laptop just isn't really good enough to kind of dig into it. But what it's got me pumped for is Black Desert, which is coming out at some point.
What specifically do you have against tab targeting MMOs?
It feels uninteractive to me. Maybe uninteractive isn't the right word, but like it feels very mechanical and less about like it feels like there's less personal skill involved, and the skill is all about like group positioning and like flawlessness of execution, which sometimes I like, but it just doesn't appeal to me in MMOs because there's the way you do it in MMOs, usually you have one guy calling shots and everybody is kind of like mashing their like I don't like rotations as kind of a concept. I feel like it's kind of like not my favorite. Like I just don't like how that plays out in practice. It doesn't feel like there's
I find it amazingly amusing because I think of rotations as being the exact kind of like pursuing a mastery in rotations is a lot like pursuing a mastery in like a platformer, like Super Meat Boy kind of thing, right? Where it's like, the mechanics are very straightforward, but the context of the second to second situation changes it up. And so it's like the tension I feel like with rotations is how can I continue to get off my optimal rotation while dodging all of these hazards and playing the situation right at the same time I'm playing my character right. I think that tension is what makes rotations work for me, I guess.
Okay, I think I could see that. I think for me the issue is the reason I really like platformers and not kind of this style is that the execution kind of margins are never tight enough for me to be like, it's not like with a platformer, it's like especially a super hard one like a Super Meat Boy. You have like very small margins for error. And the other part of that is when you fail, you get like high repetitions. And for me, like the kind of margins over the whole fight for an MMO are a little bit too wide for me to feel really kind of pressured by it. Maybe I just haven't played at a high enough level, and that's part of it. But and also I just don't think it's repeatable. Like I think having to play like having to do like 3 or 4 attempts to down a boss in a raid is a slog, and it's disliked, I think, for good reason. Having to for a platform very difficult platformer, like you get something like 50 or 60 different kind of iterations on the really tough levels, and that doesn't feel bad to me.
Yeah, I don't think that it can be super tight though, because it's based on like the team.
Sure. Yeah. No.
So, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's wrong, right? Like I'm just saying I don't think it can be tight. I think you're absolutely right that it has to be a little bit looser, and that's why it doesn't appeal to me as much.
Yeah, I feel that.
And these kind of reticle targeting systems that are becoming more popular, I think appeal more to me because it feels a little bit more like a fighting game, a little bit more moment to moment, and like, well, at the end of the day, I think it's still like, I think very similar to a rotation in some ways. It's, you know, a little bit more than just hitting the keys in the right order, which is what a lot of tab targeting based things feel like to me. But unless you really want to dig into that anymore, I think it's about time.
I was just wondering, I suppose. Yes, our beautiful main topic, my favorite kinds of topics. I love talking like philosophically about, you know, game stuff. So I'm just going to start by saying that I think a word-by-word definition is stupid. I think this is the trap that people fall into, is people want to create like a hard-nosed definition, right? That they can, you know, they can put it on a stake in a mountain, and, you know, that's their hill to die on, this you know, word for word definition. And I just think that's a trap. It's like trying, you know, like you know what a game is, right? And you know what you think a game is. And I think letting your kind of like letting it be abstract is the optimal way to talk about this stuff, because otherwise it just becomes like a pedantic slog of, you know, bringing up stupid counterexamples constantly, which sucks. That just sucks.
Yeah, I agree. I think the trap though is, I think the reason that it's so easy to fall into that trap is things like, well, you have these very kind of heartbreak points for some people, like a couple weeks ago, I think Mark, you know, said something along the lines of, this is a hot topic for a lot of people, is like, our games that are, to paraphrase, our games that are in kind of the category of walking simulator, are they games? And I think it's kind of the easy way to fall into the trap is to say yes or no, and then someone says why, and then you try and kind of like craft a definition to include those things but exclude other things.
Oh my god, it's such a fucking pain. I mean, that said, I actually do have, you know, like, the other thing is, like, I have my personal definition or whatever, but it's not rock solid. And I understand that it's not rock solid. And it fits into kind of the broader, it fits into my broader, like, universe canon of media theory in general that extends to film and comic books and television and everything like that. Yeah, I just like trying to nail it down, trying to like argue it, trying to prove that somebody else's definition of a game is wrong is a huge trap to fall into. I kind of feel it's like trying to define art. Have you ever tried to do that? It's always impossible. It's always impossible.
Right.
Like because you know, like the dictionary definitions are all terrible. It's like, oh, something that is aesthetically pleasing, and it's like, yeah, well, okay.
Boobs.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Exactly, right? Like, how does that count? How does that count as art or whatever? And you know, you could bring it up. You know, this kind of comes into the thing I referenced, I guess last week, which was games as art and games as sport, right? It's aesthetically pleasing to watch a really awesome catch in football, right? Like to see a super, you know what I mean? But like, is that art? I don't really think so. You know, of course that's not art to me, right? But at the same time, you know, as soon as I say that, it's like, well, okay, how about a dance competition? Oh, that's, of course, you know, like where are these lines? These lines, they don't exist. They're stupid. It's just, it's kind of crazy to get into the nitty gritty there. And I think that it's really just, you know, people have got philosophy. Hey man, just be hippies about it, and everybody has their own philosophy, and that's cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I think we're gonna at least try and talk around this Sisyphean task, right? Maybe roll the boulder around the hill on a circuit instead of up it. But you know, it's a tough thing to do, like I said, because I do think I see the arguments for people who say like, well, a walking simulator doesn't constitute, like, you know, like something like Gone Home doesn't constitute a game because you don't really do any, like, you know, like you just kind of are are controlling a body as it goes through the story, and does that really qualify enough for a game, or should it be categorized as something separate, and should we recognize them as the kind of the same things? And then like you can see the other pieces brought into this, like something like the game I recommended last week in Her Story, where like I can definitely kind of look at it and be like, well, there's this kind of like guessing mechanic where you're trying to figure out what the different tags are, and it's not really like there's no way to lose that game, and and when you win that game is kind of arbitrary too. Like, yes, you can access all the different files, but you'll probably figure out what the whole story is before that. And in the same kind of way, like, have you won a game when you beat the final boss, or is it when you get 100% completion? I just think these things are kind of like hard to define, but I think worthwhile to talk about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think that it gets interesting in the nitty-gritty. We'll probably open up a can of worms as I get into this, but there's kind of this concept, and I see it's been universally repulsed by academia at this point, because I do kind of in a tertiary sense follow games academics and like hardcore game critics and stuff like that who have been thinking around some of these problems or whatever. And basically what happened from a history perspective is these two terms kind of arose in opposition to one another, ironically, but they're not, which is narratology and ludology, right? And this idea that, ludologists ludologists kind of combine, like rules and systems of games from an anthropological perspective and a sociologist's perspective and a historical perspective and an economist perspective into a ludologist perspective, right? And narratologists do the same thing, but from kind of the literary perspective and just all of that other stuff, right? And somehow these words kind of got like in the eternal game of telephone that is the internet, they got like coalesced down somehow into opposing ideologies, right? Like you're either a ludologist and you say that games are about gameplay fundamentally and everything else is secondary, or you're a narratologist and you say that games are about narrative fundamentally and everything else is secondary or immaterial or whatever. But that debate actually never happened from an academic perspective where like the terms came from, right? They're just terms that arose at about the same time that kind of keyboard warriors on NeoGAF and 4chan co-opted for their own devices. I don't know if you want to respond.
No, I don't know if I really have anything to respond to that with. Just kind of the only thing I would put out there is just to be clear, Ludo. That kind of root, Ludo is like from the Latin to play, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
And so just to be clear on terms for our audience, anything that begins with that kind of Ludo prefix is about kind of like the mechanics of the game as opposed to the story elements or I don't know, which is kind of the thing at play here, right? Narratology versus ludology.
Yeah. To be honest, I think the singular thing that brought that debate to the forefront is literally the term ludonarrative dissonance. Yeah, and I kind of hate ludonarrative dissonance. Really gets a bad rap in like gamer culture and stuff. But I do think it's a really useful term. Like it's something that I think about and that I use proactively. But like it's become a meme almost where like I find myself explaining the concept of ludonarrative dissonance in other words because I don't want to bring up it just has so much baggage that I never want to bring it up.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about maybe again for another podcast about when the ludonarrative dissonance is okay and when it's not. But I think that I think for the better, it's kind of kind of introduce these ideas to people and giving them a way to talk about it without kind of being like, well, the gamey parts or the story parts, and like kind of talk about it in a little bit more in a way that kind of I don't know, lends it a little bit more weight, I guess, in an academic sense, because it uses fancy words.
Do you so if I were to if I were to ask you whether games or story is more important, what would you say?
I would probably say that I would probably say
gameplay or story.
If you absolutely held a gun to my head and made me say games or story, I would say generally gameplay.
See, this is an interesting thing, kind of from my perspective. Why do you say that?
Well, first, I'd like to preface by saying that the answer is actually it depends. But if you're making me choose, I'm choosing gameplay because I think that's something that's unique and inherent to a game, and therefore, like you can tell a story in a variety of mediums, and that kind of like, and if you're just kind of telling a story using kind of like it's specific to video games, right? Like you're kind of just playing a movie with a weird camera. Whereas I think gameplay is the thing that really brings the medium to life.
So wow, geez, that is, I really disagree with that. So you think? So okay, fundamentally, games that are stories in games. Are there stories in games that you feel like could just be like copy pasted out to other media?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Are the best stories in games stories that can be copy pasted out to other media?
No.
So that's what I think. This is like the kind of foundation of my thing. I think it's a little bit of a trap to have that line of thinking, right? That because gameplay is unique to games, so to speak, it kind of devalues that story half in comparison almost. Whereas, I agree that narratives exist in dozens of media, but the kind of narrative that you have in a book is fundamental. Like a good narrative in a book is different than a good narrative in a game, is different than a good narrative in a movie, because those media are specifically suited towards specific narratives, almost, right? And the way you structure your story, the way you have your characters, the way you do this, that, and the other thing, they all focus in and highlight and downplay certain aspects of that narrative that require changing, right? This is why adaptations are adaptations, and that kind of forgives the whole thing from my perspective. I also think of, and you've taken issue to this before, but I also think of as gameplay as being fundamentally pretty similar to things like cinematography or like mise-en-scène or editing or something like that.
See, I think it's more important than those things, because like I think that that those stories that are the best stories in video games are only as good as they are because the gameplay kind of backs them up in that way and makes them kind of realize that way. And I don't think that those stories would be the best stories they could be without the gameplay behind them. I think if they were bad
right,
games,
but I don't think
you wouldn't want them.
Sure, but I don't think that the best movies of all time are going to be the best movies of all time without their great cinematography or their great editing or their great whatever. The thing that I think is interesting about this is I don't think kind of layman, quote unquote, viewers think about cinematography or think about editing in the same way that layman gamers think about gameplay, right? Like gameplay, sure. Because so I've seen the other half of this being I took film classes. I know like hardcore film people that are insufferable, but the kinds of people that say stuff like, narrative is such a crutch for films, man. The only real films, man, are like experimental thing. It's a 30-second thing and it has no characters. It's just a hand washing a car for 30 seconds. These are the kinds of like art house, things. That's just cinematography. There's no story there in the same way that Tetris is just gameplay. There's very little story there. And where in one sense that's been confined to art house, and the other sense it's like mainstream.
See, that's kind of when I want to pause you there. Sorry for interrupting you, but it's like, you know, your average person isn't going to look at a video of a hand washing car for 30 seconds and be like, well, that was worth my time. But the average person can look at like a game of Tetris and be like, this is something, this is fun, this is something that's engaging, and this is something that really kind of, you know, is a game, right? Like it's something that like speaks to what it is to play a game, right? Like like a pure cinematography movie does not really, in my opinion, speak to what is a movie, but a pure gameplay game does that, right? Like, to use an example from last week, Rocket League, right? That game has no narrative. It's game as sport in one of its, you know, more pure forms. And you can come into that and you can see why that game why that kind of stands on its own as a pure gameplay piece, rather than and I don't think you can do that with your kind of aligned elements from other narratives, right? Like, you can't have a book that's just all like nice typeface and just random letters. You know, the typeface is you know, part of the book, you know, like in some cases more important than others, or like the pages it's printed on, all that kind of stuff are important, but they don't stand on their own, where I think gameplay is unique in that it does stand on its own. As opposed to those other elements.
Oof, I 100% disagree with this, mostly just from a like historical perspective. I think socially we're conditioned to, you know what I mean? Like we've kind of just ingrained, developed okay, just to backtrack this a little bit, games have not been around for 50 years, right? Games have been around for thousands of years. And even before video games existed, right? Tag existed and baseball you know what I mean? And all that kind of stuff. So So we've been, as a society, for thousands of years, conditioned to understand games and gameplay, right? But cinematography, on the other hand, cinematography doesn't exist in a world without in a world without a photograph, right? So it hasn't existed I guess it has existed for more than 100 years at this point, right? But and maybe if you want to talk about composition, right? Composition exists in portraits and stuff from the Middle Ages and fine art and everything like that. That's also kind of a piece of this. But I think it's entirely sociological in that, like, there is a hypothetical Earth where we never played games, but you know, like photography has been with the society for 2,000 years, and people are talking about like these, you know, ridiculous entirely cinematic experiences in the same way that we're talking about like games today. I don't think there's anything more inherently accessible or inaccessible about it, just like intrinsically, like fundamental to the medium. It's fundamental to the society.
I think that's untrue. I don't think there exists a world where we haven't played games for thousands of years. I think this is just kind of like how people like work, right? Like this is going to get a little bit more deep than I thought it was, but like,
yeah, watch out, Unwise Index. We can do super deep shit.
But I just think that like part of being a person is kind of like this kind of drive to amusement in some way, and like playing, like I think I can't imagine, or I just don't think it's realistic to imagine a world where nobody's played games. Like, that's just kind of a weird kind of concept to kind of wrap your head around, right? Like
I do agree that it is certainly super out there. The point I'm trying to make, by the way, overall, I mean, I'm proving it in a very backwards manner, but the point I'm trying to make overall is that I don't think that either cinematography or gameplay or story are more intrinsic than anything else, right?
Sure.
And that, like, value, like, to go back, I 100% agree with the way that you originally answered this. Was like, well, it depends, right? I think the original BioShock had a great narrative and it had great gameplay, and those two things kind of, you know, they did the fusion dance and they combined into be, you know, to be a great game, right? And I think The Walking Dead had a great narrative, and it had ridiculously, simple, straightforward, uncomplex gameplay. But those two things really combined, and they did the fusion dance to make a great game. In the same way that I think League of Legends, it has very, very, very little story, and the story that is there is fucking garbage. But the gameplay is super solid, right? And those things combined to make a great game. And I imagine that's a statement that you would agree with.
I would, but I think an important thing to point out there is that while the gameplay in The Walking Dead is very, very simple, it's still pretty solid for what it is, right? Like, we can talk about the difference, like, in terms of design versus technical execution as well, right? Like, there was one of the mech games for the Kinect, right? Like, straight up just doesn't work, right? And that game could have the best story of all time, but I would never know because no one could get past the first mission because the Kinect didn't work.
Sure. I guess I'm not really saying, I don't think the gameplay in The Walking Dead is bad. Really what I mean to say is like, let me think. It's simple. It's uncomplex. I think as humans we strive for complexity, right? And the best game of all time will be one that is like perfectly complex but also accessible, like a very weird conciliation of things that like it is super, super deep, but not ridiculously convoluted and complicated to like mine that depth, so to speak. And you can get to great status with super simple story or super simple gameplay, right? This is how, Civilization makes it up there in my book, right? There's really not all that much. I mean, there is a little bit of story to that game in a kind of create your own narrative sense. But at the end of the day, that game is just a bag of mechanics, and its wealth of mechanics is what makes it great. And the appropriateness of that story to those mechanics is what makes it great. And the inappropriateness, for instance, in BioShock Infinite is like a great go-to example of this. The inappropriateness of those mechanics to that story is something that holds BioShock Infinite back from that point.
Sure. I mean, the only thing I'd kind of respond to that with is that I think this is, like, again, something that kind of makes gameplay special and important in my eyes, is that a good game can have good story and simple mechanics, and or great mechanics and no story. But I don't think that kind of balance exists in other mediums, right? Like, I don't think you can have great, like, this is just going to wrap back to the argument we had about like the fundamentalness of gameplay, but that's just something I thought that.
Well, so maybe cinematography isn't like a great example of this, but acting is, right? Like, I think that there are great movies that have simple, straightforward stories, but are elevated by wonderful performances from actors, right? And that's something that propels them into that great status, right? I mean, I think the same thing is true for cinematography, right? This is, I mean, all of you film nerds out there, I want you to appreciate this reference I'm making. There is a movie by a Hong Kong director named Wong Kar-wai called In the Mood for Love. And the story isn't, the story is pretty straightforward. It's two people find out that their respective spouses are cheating on them with the other, and they strike up a friendship out of that. And the story is super straightforward. They kind of meet, they become friends, normal stuff, right? And it does nothing special with its editing. It does nothing special. It's not like these are great powerhouse performances or whatever or anything like that. But the cinematography in that movie is so fucking good. It's ridiculous how good Wong Kar. It is straight up the best shot movie I've ever seen in my entire life. And that's what propels it into great status for me. If it didn't have that cinematography, if it had craftsman cinematography, like, half of the guys directing, and Colin Trevorrow, who just directed Jurassic World, this guy isn't a cinema, he doesn't, he just shoots for clarity and nothing else. That if he directed that movie, it would have been just okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the counter to that would be like, is there a movie where like, like if we take that movie, I mean, you said that they were all kind of like I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like is average a fair word to use for their like the performance and the story?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, is if the acting had been like, I like a boob, and the female said, I like dicks, would the cinematography have still propelled it to greatness? Would like that still have been able to kind of save it?
Yeah, but I feel like that would have been bad.
Yes, but that's my point, right? Like you said, League of Legends has bad story, but it's a pretty great game because it's focused on sport. And maybe this kind of art versus sport argument is kind of, it feels kind of like that's kind of where we're dividing.
That's true. I definitely do think League of Legends is terrible art and it's spectacular sport.
I think this is actually kind of the crux of this kind of argument, right? Like, you can't have movies as sport. You can't have books as, like, now I'm imagining people throwing books at each other. But that's
right, but you can have books and movies as other stuff. You can have movie as educational tool to teach my, minimum wage employees how to do whatever, right? And that's not art. That's an instructional video. A workout video is the same medium as The Godfather, right? But it's not art.
No, I think my deeper point here is not necessarily that, like, I don't think that anybody, as educate, like, any of the alternate forms for for these other entertainment mediums ever kind of get put up against their art form, right? Like, I just don't think that ever happens, because no one ever would, who, if you said, the greatest book in the world is, like, knots and how to tie them, right? Like, everybody's gonna kind of look at you sideways.
But I think somebody could say that a memoir or a history book or just a nonfiction book of whatever variety, I'm sure people would put encyclopedias and, the Webster Dictionary up there, even though those don't have narratives. They're not. And I don't think those are art, right? I don't think an encyclopedia is art in the same way I don't really think, Rocket League is art.
Right, but I just don't think people, like, I think this kind, the kind of onus for this discussion is, I don't think people, like, if you were to make the argument that, like, the dictionary is the greatest book ever written, somebody might be like, that's very clever, buddy. But they wouldn't kind of, like, take that as kind of, like you wouldn't have, like, a wave of people being like, dictionary, and a wave of people being like, Shakespeare. But I think that's what kind of happens in games. You have a wave of people being like, Rocket League, and a wave of people being like, Undertale, or
So I think this also this comes down to a sociological thing, which is that aside from kind of books as art, right? You don't really have books as like, there's no other category of books as amusement, and maybe this is what, like, kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, I think
game as sport and game as art are both game as amusement, entertainment, or whatever, right? But there's kind of no parallel when it comes to movies or when it comes to books or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I don't really think that makes it anything. I don't really think that makes it anything special. In the same way that I don't really think that, like, the presence of cinematography makes you know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make movies special in comparison to books, or in comparison, the fact that TV is chopped up, right? Like, what's the difference between film and TV? Well, one is serialized, and its great form is meant to be digested in longer amounts of time than an hour and a half to 3 hours. That's fine. That doesn't bug me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, my point there is, I think that this is kind of like this fundamental divide that people fall along, right? Like, that the reason this discussion even exists is that there are these two camps that kind of I don't kind of, like, think along these lines, and I think people in both camps are very guilty of kind of not wanting to, like I think this all kind of starts from kind of like this very gut feeling, right? Like, if if I had never had this conversation with you before, and you kind of like jumped out of a bush on the street and said, "What's the most important part of a game?" And I would be like, "Gameplay," right? Like that's like that's kind of like my very gut reaction, right? And I think that, I think that a lot that there's that some people would be like gameplay, and some people would be like story, or like the people that just kind of like think in these kinds of ways, and I think that's kind of, or maybe even just to kind of explore like kind of the fandom a little bit, is maybe you jump out on the sidewalk and you say, "What's the most important part of games?" And I say gameplay, and you're like, "No, you're wrong, it's story." And then people just start yelling at each other.
This is, by the way, this is exactly what the ludology versus narratology, like a non-debate is.
Yeah.
Actually, funnily enough, one of the guys who coined the term, I think he coined the term ludology, put out a paper 5 years later in 2004 where he was like, I think it's called like Ludology and the Debate That Never Happened, where he literally explains that no one has ever fought about this, right? It's literally just perspectives on it's literally just people who have a perspective, who have a specific focus academically, right? They focus their perspective on that in the same way that like a sociologist looks at ancient Egypt in a different way than an anthropologist, in a different way than an archaeologist, in a different way than a historian, right? You have a ludologist looking at a game, and you have a narratologist looking at a game.
Right. Right. No, I
people. I do agree though. People go fucking. I also think that this is just an outgrowth of gamers being kind of naturally competitive and naturally kind of. I don't remember if it's right or left brained, but naturally very analytically brained, right? And so there's a lot of like. I think that movies are allowed to be wishy-washy because they're almost seen as creative, and for theater kids, to kind of like co-opt one of our other terms, whereas games are for Captain Crunches, and so like they have to live by these hardcore definitions. It has to be, as I commonly taunt you with, a 1 or a 0, and it cannot, they cannot coincide.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel. I think part of that too is kind of like, it's kind of, it's in somewhat of a parallel. Like there's like these very hardcore, say, action porn flicks, as they're called, where there's like really nothing happening except for like gun shooting and like flips happening and all that kind of what have you, and people really like those, and they're the type of people who would be like, oh, well, that's just kind of like brain dead.
Yeah, I know.
Brain dead gun shooting, right? And I think they're like, in video games, there's someone will be like, "Nuh-uh, this is real important stuff, Mom." Like I think this is like as stupid as it sounds, I think this comes from a lot of people like, "No, video games aren't stupid, Mom." And when somebody's like, "Oh, those video games are brainless," right? Like someone's like, "No, Mom was not right." Like that kind of like.
And I definitely agree with you, and I definitely think that like I totally think that discussion, like from a like culture perspective, has been terrible for the culture itself, because what has kind of happened is like people want to, like, gamers, they want to play critically acclaimed games, and they want to play well-regarded games, and they want people, right, to look at them and think about them and say, oh, because I played BioShock, I am learned, right? I am sophisticated, right? But in the exact same breath, right, I think a big problem from a culture perspective is that people don't want critiques of games, they want reviews of games, right? A critique in a classical sense of like, let's evaluate the art of this thing, that doesn't get any hits. Nobody reads that article, right? But this, how does it play, right? Does it have bugs? Are the graphics good? It reads like I'm buying a car when I read a review of a game, not like I'm going to a movie. And I think that that's also kind of like another half of it, right? That people want to, they want games to be art, like from a sociological perspective, but they don't want them to be art from like an artistic perspective, because as soon as they are, they're open to a lot more critiques than they have been in the past.
Sure, and I think this is also kind of its own can of worms too, because like I think that part of this is people writing critiques and presenting them as reviews. And it's kind of, again, a very gut reaction where it's like, you played this game, I played this game, I enjoyed this game, and then Nanny McSassy Pants on the internet said it's not very, it's not very good in some ways. Like, and it's like, no, I do not like a bad thing. I like a good thing, and it is good.
Yeah,
because...
100%. One of the most important things that ever happened to me in college, that actually happened to me in a classroom, was we were talking about a movie. We had just watched this film, and I hated this film, and another classmate of mine really liked the film, and we argued about it pretty extensively for maybe like 10 minutes or so. And then the professor more or less interrupted us, and she just said, "This is really important when we're talking about art, so let me just let this sink in. But two people can look at the same movie and come to radically different conclusions about its quality, and neither is more right than the other," right? And I think that really, that's a big thing about talking about art. There's no right answer when it comes into art. Everyone has biases. Everyone has tastes. Everyone, I think the new Star Wars movie has a lot of flaws, and I talk about those flaws a lot. And I have plenty of people who, I don't want to spoil the movie for anybody, I guess, who hasn't seen this movie, even though it's about to be the biggest movie of all time. There are things about this movie that I think are bad characterization, and that my friends say, no, that's good characterization, and vice versa, right? Because we're coming at it from different perspectives, and I think that's something that gets so lost in gamer culture. It can only be good. It can only be bad. I think, Metacritic is, it's garbage. I hate it so much. And the idea of, the toxicity of review scores comes directly out of this phenomenon.
Yeah, and not to kind of touch the kind of the kind of debates that kind of rage in this world of video game criticism, but I think that part of it too is that there are people, not necessarily people writing these critiques sometimes, but there are people that will look at these and will say nasty things, to put it lightly, to other people based on something that was said in a critique or a review somewhere. And yeah. I think that's just a poor thing for the fandom as a whole type of deal. And I think that's kind of important. And I think, funnily enough, we've kind of gotten off track about this is less about what are games and more about what do people think games are, which I think is a very interesting conversation, because I think that's ultimately where this discussion comes from, right? Ultimately, I don't think it's important that what you or I thinks a game is, or what Mark thinks a game is, or what Monik or Akshay thinks a game is. I think it's kind of why do people think these things, and are there important things to kind of explore about that?
Yeah, I definitely, yep. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
I think that's kind of why this conversation has gone this way.
And I also think that it's, these are the building blocks of culture, and I don't think that, culture really resists categories and categorization, you know what I mean? I could write just as compelling a, think piece on why the 90s suck as why the 90s are great. You know what I mean? From a cultural perspective, because it's just it's such a massive, massive thing that you there's no way to talk about the literal entirety of it in any conceivable way without leaving some things out, right? And then as soon as you start leaving stuff out, that means that all of the stuff that you elected to put in is all of a sudden way more important. And because, the network of things that you put in bounce off one another in such a way, it warps the perception of this kind of stuff. I think this is a big problem, or not a problem, but I think this is a big phenomenon that happens when it comes to games in terms of people talking about eras, right? I think people forget the shittiness of the Nintendo era, and so in the present time, they see shittiness as it happens, and they compare and they say, oh, fucking games have been going downhill ever since, you know, the N64 kind of thing, right? And that's just like, it's really lamentable.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of true for all mediums, though, right? Like you remember.
Oh yeah. Oh, certainly, dude. Okay, you have not. I really enjoy, you know, like I really enjoy reading up on film stuff and reading up on TV stuff and reading up on whatever. But it is so insufferable to hear people talk about the death of cinema because things aren't like they were in the 1970s. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, yeah, a bunch of really good movies came out at that time, and directors kind of didn't have as much of a leash, and it was kind of a perfect storm of economics to create a lot of really big, high-profile movies that are also very, very good. But that doesn't make the decade any better, you know, than like the other ones, right? It just looks like that because of the way that, you know, we've been conditioned to kind of look at it, and it's just I hate that shit.
And the other half of that is that like the mediocre and the light dretch gets forgotten, right? Like the only things that get remembered are the very, very good, and then like the so abysmally awful that they kind of leave their mark in their badness. Right, like,
yeah, I know, man. It's like people talk.
It's very hard to be that bad type of
people
deal.
talk about superhero fatigue, and I can't help but just be like, was there Western fatigue in the 50s? Because there were a billion fucking Westerns that came out. Was there, you know, like, was there crime, you know, like fatigue in the 70s? Was there like, you know, like the 80s action hero, like the Rambo action hero, was there that fatigue in the 80s? It's like, no, these things don't exist. Yes, the good superhero movies come out, bad superhero movies come out, a dozen of them, you know, come out in the span of however many years, but these rates are the exact same rates as other genres. It's just that superheroes have kind of chameleoned their way in the past 15, and it's, you know.
Yeah, no.
The same thing is true for games, by the way, because I mean, everybody remembers Mario and Sonic, but nobody remembers all of the garbage platformers that came out, you know. And I remember playing them because they're the kinds of games that your mom buys for you, kind of thing. But like, God, they were so bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, no, I think that's pretty straight true, right? Like everybody remembers E.T. on the Atari, but nobody remembers any of the other junk, like maybe Pitfall, because that was hard, and I don't know.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what other like super. They're like famous Atari games besides that. Well, there's also like I think the Atari games also kind of get a little bit like subsumed in the arcade. You know,
yeah,
I'm pretty sure
there's the first like the time for a history lesson, kids, but like everything pre the first crash is kind of like prehistory to most video game people, especially of our age.
Yeah,
you know, like which
I think it really colors. I think it really colors people our age. Like, for instance, you and I have a very different perspective on video games, and I think that comes up a lot because you started way younger than I did. You know, my first game system was a Game Boy Color, and it was Pokemon. But my first real system where I had a lot of games and a lot of time to play them was the PlayStation 2. So, like, the formative years of my game playing were focused on PS2 and early PC gaming. Well, not early PC gaming, but, like, you know, turn of the millennium PC gaming, whereas, you know, yours, or like, you know, for instance, Akshay with Street Fighter. Like, Street Fighter is a huge game for him because of his history for it. Yeah. And I think that stuff really colors people's perceptions on it.
I agree. I agree 100%.
So I'm gonna not to throw another wrench into here, but I really want to like unpack this a little bit. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Roger Ebert doesn't think games are art. Do you know Roger Ebert's argument, like the argument that he made that isn't just?
I haven't read it in a long time, a very long time. So please.
So I think this is really interesting. Roger Ebert says that games cannot be high art specifically is what he goes for, because they cannot be the expression of an author, right? High art necessitates a like brick wall between author and audience, and by their very nature there is no brick wall for games, right? There's no such thing as a game that doesn't have, or that does have that wall, right? Like at some point, like you take command of the controller, and even if you go through like the most, railroady of railroads, like The Walking Dead or kind of whatever, right? You break that brick wall, which breaks your ability to have like high art. How do you feel about that definition in general?
I'm gonna say I don't like it, but definitions of art is that might be like above my pay grade, right? Because like it's very kind of like I think I am more what's the right way to put this? I'm more pedestrian than you when it comes to the kind of like high film criticism and whatnot.
Yeah.
Given that you have like half a degree in it or a full degree in it, and I have like a computer science degree, that I'm just not going to have that same kind of insight as you do. But like that kind of like nothing's like when you read that to me, right? Nothing like my immediate reaction is like, why does high art have to have this brick wall? Like, why is that kind of presumed to be necessary, and like is what about high art makes that true, and what does he mean by high art as opposed to, I don't know, like medium art, short art?
Yeah, I feel that. I think the kind of interesting thing that I always kind of focus on is I feel like games are very lacking in artists in general, right? Like, okay, so Mass Effect 2 is my favorite game of all time, right? And the project director for Mass Effect 2, because the terminology for this shit is garbage, is Casey Hudson. Is Mass Effect 2 Casey Hudson's game? Well, it's about, like, we just kind of haphazardly assign it to, like, the shotgun blast of, oh, it's a BioWare game. But, like, there's also no guarantee that the same people are working there, right? Like, famously, after The Walking Dead Season 1, like, came out and was a huge hit, right? And, it won Game of the Year that year, which was in 2012 and everything. Literally everyone on the team left. And then Telltale kept putting out games, right? But so it's this really nebulous concept in gaming culture that I find ridiculously interesting.
Yeah, because there are some things that kind of you can tie into those, right? Like Undertale, Toby Fox. That is probably his game, right? Like that.
Yeah,
that,
definitely.
But I think for most games, especially even the well-regarded ones that are kind of high, like there's the director, there are the game designers. There's part of this is as you said, like even if we don't agree that about the importance of gameplay is like the relative importance of gameplay is a piece of this. Like, are the designers of those subsystems, how responsible are they for this game being great because the systems feel smooth? How responsible are the programmers for programming it so that it's smooth, right? Like, how responsible are the testers for making sure you don't hit that kind of for not hitting a suspension of disbelief breaking glitch of some sort. I think maybe it's easy to cut out some of those people, right? Like in the same way that you say, like, well, the person manning the camera is probably not responsible or as responsible as the director in a movie, but I think those kind of responsibilities get kind of divvied up in a much broader way than, like, I think it's much less pyramidal than in your typical movie. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I have no idea how to parse that really in my own mind. I have, because even the ones that are like famous, right? Like Sid Meier, right? Everybody
Yeah.
knows Sid Meier, right? Everybody can think of the name of one specific guy who gave a talk at a GDC, but like it's really nebulous to talk about and to understand. To understand it, I think the big difference. I do agree that there's a difference between film and video games, but I think it's because film worked its way into that. Very early films were not this way at all. They were very assembly line productions, right? But as things like the French New Wave and auteur theory came about, right, directors kind of co-opted more and more power, and the film-based studio system that we have today is very conducive to talking about directors as artists. Because they very much are, right? Just in the way that, like, hierarchical the industry is structured. But because games weren't birthed out of movies... The same thing is true, by the way, of TV, right? Because TV gets birthed out of movies, and now you have showrunners who are the same thing, right? Community is Dan Harmon is the artist behind Community, right? But games didn't come from that environment. Industry speaking, they came from Silicon Valley tech companies, right? And yeah, there's a bunch of, there's a couple of game developers that like look like Steve Jobs to a certain extent, right? Like Morello at Riot, maybe, right? But like it's structurally they're so different that it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Man, I have a really tough time with this thought, but it's just like it's something that I do think about a lot because I feel like game history is in a really big there's like a big danger of people just throwing out games and us losing track of games and not being able to find them, not being able to replay them, right? Like that's a shame. That sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the other part of this is I don't think that there's necessarily a need or a desire to kind of move to that kind of a format where it's controlled by websites. I think there's room for those types of games. Like I said, Undertale with Toby Fox, I think is in large part due to his singular vision on that game. But I don't think you can create the kind of length, kind of epic style of game that you can get with a team, in that kind of format. Oh,
I kind of disagree with that. Well, I don't really think I don't necessarily know that I think like film or whatever is the best structure for it, but I do think a better structure is kind of required, and that a lot of the industry pains that we hear about, that we see, that we talk about, are because these companies are built on a model that is not suited for the products they produce, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's really tough to kind of parse it because this is people who work in movies are very, very used to being freelancers, but people who work in tech are not. Right. And so the idea that like I'm a developer and I freelance from project to project, from game to game, that feels shitty because of what the structure kind of demands of me, but it doesn't have to be. Plenty of people make their living by doing kind of freelance movie to movie, project to project thing, and I think that's just as like kind of valid structure as any other. And that I feel like games will kind of rest on their own unique version of this structure that is going to be pretty radically different from what we have today.
Oh, sure. Maybe. I was more speaking to the kind of like the single author type of...
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Specifically. But yeah, I could...
I'll just take that thought and go...
No,
the opposite
direction. I think that's fair. I think I like the more you say it, right? Like a kind of format where like, a big publisher kind of accepts like a game synopsis. I don't like, and then you assemble kind of your team and you work on that game and you kind of disperse after that. That'd be radically different. And I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think that's an interesting thought experiment at the very least.
And yeah, and it's obviously not. This doesn't work for Riot. This doesn't work for Blizzard. But that's because Riot and Blizzard aren't making one-offs. Almost all of their games are longevity based, right? Like, you're supposed to play League of Legends for years. And I think that a lot of that kind of movement, so to speak, in games, and this, we've talked a little bit about this, but that this movement away from these kinds of games bugs me. But like the one and done kind of games, like your Mass Effect 2s, like your Deus Ex Human Revolutions, because they are not built for the structure, they're almost kind of going away to a certain extent compared to the World of Warcrafts and the League of Legends, which are very much built for that structure because it's constantly generating new content for an ongoing kind of thing. I don't know, man. It's really weird. It's also way above our pay grades.
I think unfortunately part of that is less about art and more about economics.
Definitely.
Which is always part of the equation, even in your movies and your books, that like the economics of selling enough copies, or like generating enough revenue, but kind of drifting away from that and kind of drifting into a little bit more about like what are the meaning of games, what games mean. And I kind of want to ask you this. I'm hesitant because I don't want it to kind of devolve it into nitty gritty, but it's been kind of like it's kind of been sitting on my mind since we started this cast. Just kind of this very kind of basic question is about like where kind of like what kind of, in the very basic way, what makes a game as it kind of relates to this classical kind of point of walking simulators, and like interaction, and is there a line, right? Like there's the thing that brought this up to me is that during the Steam sale, to get your free cards, you go through your discovery queues and you mark things, and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, Steam decided to show me every single Sakura title, which, if you are not familiar, for those at home, they're basically softcore porn visual novels. And they're only softcore because they are on Steam and they do not allow hardcore titles. But that's its
I thought like the hardcore version of that game. The hardcore version of the game is the game I know.
When I say softcore, I mean like they don't allow full nudity on Steam.
Right, I know, but I know those games as the games you buy to get the full nudity.
Yeah,
because I guess you could like patch it, or maybe if you buy it from a different service.
Yeah, that might be it. But this kind of popped into my head because those games are visual novels, and in the kind of less scandalous version, something like, say, a Phoenix Wright kind of falls into this kind of visual novel category, and I think these types of games kind of skirt the kind of edge of what is kind of like an interactive, like what is a comic book read on a tablet, right? Like you just hitting the button, like you're hitting the button to flip the page, and at what point is that at what point does it transform into this kind of realm of gaming? If you can venture a kind of a guess, maybe.
So my personal philosophy about media is about media is the plural form of the word medium, right? And medium is, it's not, long, medium, short. It's a medium between two. This is what a medium is. It's literally a way that I can communicate the amorphous thoughts in my brain to you, right? I take these thoughts, I condense them into something real, right? Something in the real physical world, and you absorb the thing that's in the real physical world, and it releases thoughts in your brain. This is the mechanic of what like baseline a medium is. And how do we interact with the real world? Well, we interact with our senses, right? We have 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. and we have our like time, right? So, for instance, a movie is something that, you know, it appeals to you visually, it appeals to you auditorially, right? And a television show share the same senses, but they are fractured in different ways, like temporally speaking. You're not meant to consume television in one way or another, kind of thing. And so when you start parsing out that definition of medium, when you come at it from that perspective, the answer of what is a game comes pretty clearly to me in it's it's something that simulates. Okay, so the other thing I have to explain, because this is comprehensive, I apologize. Your senses aren't always on, but they're always used, right? So if I'm reading a book, right, and in my book it says Harry Potter had black hair, right, and his robes smelled like mothballs, right? I am not physically, my physical eyes are not seeing black hair, and my nose is not smelling mothballs, but my brain knows what those things look like and smell like, right? And so on one end of this perspective, one end of the spectrum, you have active senses like sight and like sound. So I actively see, in the Harry Potter movie, I actively see Daniel Radcliffe as Harry Potter, right? My eyes are physically seeing that. And I'm actively hearing Daniel Radcliffe's voice as Harry Potter, right? But in the book, my mind is making that stuff up. And so this is the difference between active and inactive senses. Inactive senses are when, you know, in your mind's eye, in your mind's nose, you are sensing this thing, right? Games are active for your sight, for your sound, and for your touch, right? And that facet of touch is what makes them like so fundamentally different, because a game is built to utilize it's built to utilize touch as a piece of like an operative piece of it, right? Which is to say that like the game isn't the baseline litmus test for this is like the game just isn't going to go further unless you have your hands on the controller, right? You have your hands on the mouse and keyboard or whatever. Whereas like a movie, the same thing is kind of felt by a remote, but the entire context of that movie doesn't require you to it doesn't require you to hit the remote, right? You hit play, and then the movie starts and ends without you seeing it. Interestingly enough, I think comic books and book books also kind of fall into this nebulous category, because the aspect of turning the page changes it up. This is something that's really unique to comics in general, but the bottom right panel in most comics is almost a mini cliffhanger a lot of the time. Like, scenes in comics are always page by page, right? A good comic has its scene page by page because you don't want to break into, you know what I mean? You don't break into scenes in haphazard ways. That's just not good comic book making. And so, anyway, to wrap this kind of like all into its thing, visual novels to me don't really qualify. They feel much more like that comics side of thing, right? That flipping the page on my tablet kind of thing, and much less like the Walking Dead kind of thing. The Walking Dead thing, if I'm not there to make those choices, right? The fact that the choices exist make it the game, right? Even though I could sit there, not touch the controller, and it would keep going or whatever, I could alter the path of the story by changing which dialogue option I say, if I hit a button or if I don't hit a button. That's me exerting control on the story. It's me breaking down that brick wall between author and audience. Visual novels, you can't really do that, right? And I think that's kind of the difference.
Okay. I think I might have some specific. I think there's this is me kind of being a little bit deeper into the genre than you. I think there's some. I think that's fair, and I think that
to be honest, by the way, I've never played a visual novel in my life. This is me just going by what I know of them.
Yeah, and I think that some of them have a little bit more choice than others. I think so. Like I used Phoenix Wright as an example. Phoenix Wright has its own like kind of puzzle solving element to it. I think that's I think Um, I think it kind of depends on the particular visual novel, but I think you've done a good job of kind of laying down where that kind of line is.
Yeah, I mean that would be a game if there's that puzzle part of it. Well, I'm 100%
Sure.
in your camp. That
Sure.
should be a game.
I think you've done a pretty good job of putting, like, I think visual novels as kind of a medium kind of straddle that line. And I think some of them are on one side and some of them are on the other. And I think you've done a good job of putting a line down. And I think I can mostly agree with it. Something that kind of pops into my head is kind of a result of that. We touched on this briefly before, but you said that part of what's important about making, say, The Walking Dead a game is this choice, and we've talked before about kind of like the illusion of choice, and if you think it's a good choice or if you think you're making a meaningful choice in the moment, it still counts. My question to you would be then, if going into the experience, you knew that your choices didn't make a difference because some outside source informed you, does that make it somehow less of a game or less important?
I mean, it makes it less good sometimes, but also not others. I mean, I know going into the Walking Dead season 1, I think was so like successful because those choices felt like they really felt like they were big narrative things, and you were really crafting your own decision line through that story. But anybody who's gone back and replayed it to do like the opposite choices, it's really not all that different. You know what I mean? Like the same loose ends get wrapped up in different ways, and it's not like the direction of the narrative goes in some like off the wall, completely different direction. You still end up in the same spot. And you hit kind of all of the big pieces along the way. But I've gone into plenty of Telltale games after that, and I like basically all of their games. I haven't played a Telltale game I don't enjoy. Knowing that that's the case, but I can just kind of lose myself in the experience. It's like going to a Star Wars, going to the Star Wars movie. I know that the hero is going to be fine. He's going to survive until episode 8. I've been reading these reviews. I've been reading all of this stuff. I know that filming for episode 8 already started. I know that Mark Hamill is on set, right? I know that Daisy Ridley is on set. There's no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Daisy Ridley's character, that Luke Skywalker, are going to make it out of episode 7 alive, right? But I'm still with it because in the moment, the scene is crafted such that, yeah, I'm a little bit worried that she's gonna die. You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of just like the magic of being, being in the thing. And the magic of being a player of a game is I feel like these choices matter so much, even though intellectually, outside of it, I know they don't. Also, by the way, I don't really think it makes it any more or less game in general. It's just different, different aspects of it or whatever.
I think that's fair. It's just something that kind of popped into my head along the way. But yeah.
Yeah, because even super railroady experience, like, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, it's a railroad from beginning to end. There's really, there's not... you don't have narrative choice. The choice you have there is gameplay, right? The second to second, how do you beat this challenge that we've thrown at you with the systems and the tools at your disposal? That's the choices. Those are the choices that you're making in a
Sure.
Call of Duty game.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Huh.
But yeah, I don't know. Man, I love talking about it. I could do like 80 podcasts on this stuff.
Yeah.
But
I think we've covered this pretty thoroughly. I think rather than what do games mean, I think maybe more appropriate is the meaning of games. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, man.
All right. Well, I think we've explored this topic enough for 1 week. So did you have anything you wanted to mention before?
Well, we feel free to watch us discuss the meaning of tabletop games Mondays for Rise of the Nords Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and Tuesdays for Iron Gods at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Soon enough, that'll change to Hell's Rebels. I'm so excited.
I am too, actually. You can, if you have strong opinions on the matter and want to tell us why we're wrong, you can email us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com. You should also join our Facebook group.
We do have a Facebook group. That's a true thing.
Yeah, and yeah,
this is the strongest outro we've ever had.
Yep.
By all means. Farewell, dear listeners.
Yeah, farewell.